All right, welcome to the fourth, I think this is the fourth lesson in statistics. Today we're going to look at cumulative frequency. And I actually shouldn't have put the word relative in there because that's a different story altogether. And so I apologize for that. This should just be on cumulative frequency. So we'll get rid of that. And I'll tell you what relative frequency is as we move through this. But this is just on cumulative frequency. And then what happens if you have a constant change to your data set. So we're going to start looking at a cumulative frequency. Again, I shouldn't have put the word relative up here. I think I changed it later and I forgot to go back. So just a cumulative frequency, and then we're going to graph it, and the graph of it is called an ogive, and it's a silly name, but IB typically just calls it a cumulative frequency graph. So this is going back to the data on heights from one of the IB classes that we've already used in an earlier lesson. This is a frequency table. And so what we're going to do is we're going to modify that and add to it and create a cumulative frequency table. And so to do that, you are just going to accumulate your frequencies. That's why it's called cumulative. So that just means we're going to kind of add these up as we go. So as I go from box to box, cell to cell here, I'm just going to add the total that came before it, and it kind of accumulate as we go. So the first, I've accumulated one individual in heights between 58 and 60. You can check me out getting rid of this up here. And then once I go to my second cell, I pick up two more people. So I would add that to the existing one. And so I would have accumulated 3 by the time I got to 62 inches. And then by the time I got to 64 inches, I would add 7 more to what I had already accumulated. So I'd end up with 10. So what you can see is happening is whatever your new box is, you add to whatever your total accumulated was before that. So again, next one would be I have 4 more added onto the 10 gives me 14. And so this is kind of getting repetitive. So I'm just going to jump and fill all of them in. But you can see I would do 14 plus 2 to get 16, plus 1 to get 17, plus 4 to get 21, etc. And so this total here at the end is accumulated everybody in the class. So there are 23 pieces of data in this particular set of data. And this just tells me how many total I have as I've accumulated through each of these intervals. So to graph this, we're going to use this right side, this cumulative frequency over here as our x value. And the height is the right-hand side of your interval is going to be our x value. I apologize. And this cumulative frequency is going to be our y value. So in the first data point I would plot would be 61, because by the time I've gotten through 60 inches, I've accumulated 1 person. And then my second data point would be at 62 on your x-axis and a height of 3, meaning by the time I've gotten through 62 inches, I have a total of 3 people that were at least 62 inches. So just to quickly tell you what this relative frequency is, if I add a third column here, and this is more of an AP stats than the IB stats, but if I added a third column and the relative frequency would be the percentage. So this so far relatively would have 1 out of 23. So this would be whatever decimal or percent 1 out of 23 is. This would be 3 out of 23. This would be 10 out of 23. This would be 14 out of 23. And you would end up being at 100% right here because you'd have 23 out of 23. So it just changes your from these values of numbers and counts to percents. That's it. All right, so let's take a look at this. So this is not the entire what the ogive would look like, but this is a cumulative frequency of height. So again, this is at 60 at 1, 62, we're at 3. By the time we get to 64, we're up to 10. And then the final thing you would do, so you would put dots at each of those, and then you would connect them with segments. Usually I just do segments. Sometimes when you do these graphs, they'll end up looking a little bit smoother, but segments are fine. That is an acceptable way to do your ogive, so I've just manually sort of done an ogive here. And then I also did it with technology. So I did it with spreadsheets, but it's just as easy to do by hand because you just plot these dots and then you connect them with lines. And what this can tell you is a couple things. One, the steeper your incline is accumulating more people. So I picked up quite a few people between 62 and 64, and you notice that that's actually 7, and that is a pretty big chunk. And then the ones that are a little flatter is where you're hardly picking anybody up. So in essence, from 72 all the way to 76, I hardly gained any people. That's why it's so flat, and that's true right there. I only have 1 from each of those categories. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about how we can use this graph. This is the exact same graph that I just made it bigger. And we're going to look at how we can use it to figure out our percentiles. And by percentiles, it could be any percentile, but we are going to, in particular, do quartiles. So what I know for sure is, based on the data, that my last individual over here was at 23. So if I want to figure out percentiles, the 50th percentile or the median would be the person in the middle. So if I'm at 23, halfway to 23 would be about 12. I'm actually going to round here, because a lot of times when they ask you to do this from an ogive or a frequency graph, cumulative frequency graph, you are doing it approximately. So if I know that I've got 23 as my total, and maybe on a test, an IB exam or something, you can't really tell exactly where this hits between 20 and 25 if there's not individual markers, but you can see it's pretty close. It's just under 25. So that means I'm pretty sure that my median would be somewhere around here. So what I do is I know it's at about the 12th person. I come straight over as straight as I can, and then I go straight down, and I now know that my median height has to be, I didn't do a perfect job coming down here. It looks like it's pretty close to between 64 and 66. It's probably not quite 65, but that gives me an idea of what my median would be. I know my min is right here, so, and that looks like it's at about 1. So I could, and that's at 60. And I know my max was up here, and again, if I zoom over here all the way across and come down, that is at 76. And so that was my max, and that's my min, and I kind of found the median by going to the middle part. Now, between 0 and 12, the first quartile would be halfway in between. So if there's 12 is my median, right around 6 would be my first quartile. And that means I could, again, go straight across on my graph as accurately as I can and go straight down. And that does not look like it's exactly in the middle. So maybe this one I call about 62.5. And that would be my quartile 1. And then I do something very similar between 12 and 23 or 12 and 24. Halfway between would be about 18. And so that would be my third quartile, right around 18. So again, this is all approximate, and they would ask you to approximate. And I come over here and I come down, and that I'm just going to keep it and say that's about 70.5, quartile 3. And what I've accidentally done is, quite on purpose, is I created a box plot that would go along with this, because I could draw my boxes that would go between my quartiles. My median would be right there. This whisker comes down to the min. This whisker comes up to the max. And so this is how a box plot and a ogive, or frequency graph, sorry, cumulative frequency graph, could kind of go together. But the key is finding your medians over here by the middle number value, and then your quartiles. Basically, I just took 23 and divided by, and again, I rounded to 24, divided by 4, so that they would be every 6. And it's pretty close, pretty accurate. So this is just another example that I got off the internet to kind of show you. This has a max of 200, so that means that the median would be right at 100, and so that's what that 100 is right there. And this is a little bit better, because you can see that they're actually using real straight lines to come over and go down, so they can identify where that median value would be between 35 and 40, and these are actually ticked out, so you can kind of tell a little bit better. And again, if 100 is my median, my first quartile has to be at 50, because that's the first quarter, that's halfway between 0 and 100, and you could come over and drop down. There's your first quartile. And between 100 and 200, your third quartile would be 150, and you would come over, drop down. And so you know the values of your median and your quartiles. You can make your box there with your dash in the middle for the median and your little whiskers out to the edges. So that's kind of a quick use of the cumulative frequency graph. And now I'm going to, this is the same data, but instead of having it be, I think, intervals of 3, this was our table with intervals of 4. So I would like you to try to do a cumulative frequency graph for me, and then take a look at, you're going to fill in the table, and then you're going to make a graph. So pause the video and try that on your own to fill in this table for cumulative frequency, and then do an ogive. Okay, pause. All right, let's check it out. So as you went, these numbers should have been the same. And then your graph, and this graph looks fairly similar to one we just did because it's really the same data. We just have different intervals, so it's actually fewer bars or segments for you to draw. But this would be your ogive. And again, if I tried to find the median, it's not going to be too terribly different than where it was before because it's the same data. But again, you can see that there's a big pickup here, and then less pickup here in terms of picking up frequency values. So there you go. That is the cumulative, not relative, but cumulative frequency. Relative would just be changing these to percent, so that would be 100% up here at 23. 12 would be about 50%. That's the only difference between them. And that is it. I hope that you enjoyed the ogive.